killed Elvis Presley?
No, drugs had nothing to do with his death.
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing. That was proven and shown in my book.
Memphis, Tennessee. August 16th, 1977. While the world was still learning that Elvis Presley was gone, while radio stations were cutting into their regular programming, while fans were collapsing in the streets outside Graceland, while the news was spreading from city to city like a slow-moving fire, something else was happening. Something quieter. Something that almost no one noticed, because everyone was looking in the wrong direction. Inside Baptist Memorial Hospital, in a back corridor that most visitors never saw, a manila folder was being removed from the official record system. Not checked out. Not transferred through proper channels. Removed. Quietly. Deliberately. And placed into private custody before the ink on Elvis's death certificate had even finished drying. That folder was Elvis Presley's complete toxicology report, and the people who moved it knew exactly what they were doing, because what was inside that file was never, under any circumstances, supposed to reach the public. Here's what you were told. The official cause of death listed on Elvis Presley's death certificate read cardiac arrhythmia. A heart attack, essentially. Tragic, yes. Sudden, yes, but clean. Simple, the kind of ending that preserves a legacy rather than complicating it. The kind of explanation that closes doors instead of opening them. And for millions of people around the world who worshipped Elvis, that explanation was painful enough. Nobody went looking for more. But the toxicology screen told a completely different story. What the attending physicians documented in that original report, before it was reclassified, before it was sealed, before it was buried under layers of legal protection that would take 5 decades to even partially unravel, was a cocktail of at least 10 different pharmaceutical substances circulating in Elvis Presley's blood at the moment his heart stopped. 10 substances. Not 1. Not 2. 10, and several of them were present at levels that went far beyond anything that could be explained by a man simply managing chronic pain or anxiety. These were the numbers of someone who had been heavily, systematically, and continuously medicated for a very long time. And yet, the official story said, heart attack. Natural causes. Move along. To understand how that happened, how a toxicology report that detailed, that significant, that damning could be quietly folded away while the world mourned, you have to understand one name. Dr. George Nichopoulos. The man Elvis called Dr. Nick. His personal physician. His trusted medical advisor. The man who, in the final 20 months of Elvis Presley's life, had prescribed him more than 10,000 doses of narcotics, amphetamines, and sedatives. 10,000 doses in 20 months. Let that land for a moment. This wasn't a doctor managing a patient's health. This was something else entirely. And the sealed file knew it, which is exactly why the sealed file had to disappear. What followed Elvis's death was one of the most carefully orchestrated acts of narrative management in the history of American celebrity. The official autopsy findings were cherry-picked. The toxicology specifics were reclassified under medical privacy protections that in 1977 were broad enough to cover almost anything. Dr. Nick was shielded. The prescribing records were quietly absorbed into private estate documentation rather than submitted to public health authorities. And an entire machine, legal, financial, and personal, closed ranks around the official story and made sure it held. For a while it did. But here's where the story takes a turn that even the people who built that wall couldn't fully anticipate. Because the sealed files weren't only medical documents. They weren't simply toxicology screens and prescription logs and attending physician notes. Buried inside that folder, tucked between clinical records like something hidden in plain sight, were personal letters. written by Elvis himself, in the months before his death. In those letters, Elvis described in his own words what he believed was happening to his body. He described a physical deterioration he didn't fully understand. He described confusion, the kind that comes not from illness alone, but from being told by the people closest to you that what you're feeling is normal, manageable, necessary. He described a creeping sense that something was wrong that went beyond what any doctor was willing to acknowledge to his face. And he named people. Not an accusation, Elvis wasn't that kind of man, even at his most desperate, but in a way that made clear he understood, on some level, that the hands supposed to be healing him might also be the hands holding him down. Those letters stayed sealed. For 50 years, they stayed sealed, hidden inside a file that was never supposed to exist, inside a story that was never supposed to be complicated, inside a legacy that too many powerful people needed to remain exactly the way they'd constructed it. But documents have a way of surviving. Truth has a way of outlasting the people who try to bury it. And what Elvis wrote in those letters, with his own hand, in his own words, changes everything you thought you knew about how he died. And who let it happen? More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed. And that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. To understand what killed Elvis Presley, you have to understand the world he was trapped inside. Not the world his fans saw, the sequin jumpsuits, the sold-out arenas, the standing ovations that shook the walls of the Las Vegas Hilton. The other world, the one behind the curtain. The one built not around Elvis the artist, but around Elvis the asset. Because by the early 1970s, that's what he had quietly become to the most important people in his life. Not a man. Not even a performer. A machine that generated money, and a machine that needed to keep running, no matter the cost. And the architect of that machine had a secret he could never afford to let anyone discover. Colonel Tom Parker. The name is legendary in music history. The man who discovered Elvis, who shaped his career, who stood beside him from the very beginning as manager, advisor, and self-proclaimed protector. Except almost none of that image was real. Colonel Tom Parker was not a colonel. He had never served in any military. He was not even American. His real name was Andreas Cornelis van Kuyk, and he was a Dutch immigrant who had entered the United States illegally sometime in the late 1920s, a fact he spent the rest of his life concealing with extraordinary care. He had no passport. He could not apply for one without exposing his true identity and his illegal status, which meant deportation, disgrace, and the complete collapse of everything he had built. And here is where that personal secret connects directly to what ended up in Elvis's sealed medical file. Because Parker's inability to travel internationally meant that Elvis could never tour internationally. No Europe, no Japan, no Australia, no sold-out stadiums in London or Tokyo or Sydney, even as offers poured in from every direction and every promoter on the planet. While the Beatles were conquering the world, Elvis, the man who had started it all, was confined entirely to American soil. And to compensate for the revenue those international tours would have generated, Parker drove Elvis into something brutal. Vegas residencies. Domestic touring schedules so relentless they bordered on inhumane. Between 1973 and 1977, Elvis performed over 1,100 concerts. His body, already under enormous pharmaceutical strain, was being pushed through a schedule that would have broken a man in perfect health. Parker needed Elvis performing, always performing, because a performing Elvis meant money. And money meant Parker's secret stayed safe. Into this suffocating arrangement stepped Dr. George Nichopoulos, and it is important to understand that Dr. Nick was not simply a reckless physician who cared too little. The picture that emerged from documents surfaced years after Elvis's death was far more troubling than simple negligence. Financial records and contractual arrangements tied Dr. Nick's professional relationship with Elvis to the performance infrastructure itself. The prescriptions weren't incidental to the touring schedule. In a very real sense, they were what made the touring schedule possible. Uppers to get Elvis on stage, downers to bring him off it, painkillers to get him through the physical deterioration that the previous months of performance had caused. And then, more uppers, more downers, more painkillers. A cycle that compounded on itself month after month until the man at the center of it was barely recognizable as the person he had once been. And the people closest to Elvis watched it happen. The Memphis Mafia, the rotating crew of bodyguards, assistants, childhood friends, and hired loyalists who surrounded Elvis at all times, were not bystanders. Several of them, in sworn depositions taken years after Elvis's death, described scenes inside Graceland that were never captured in any official record, never submitted to any medical authority, and never came close to appearing in the sanitized story the public was handed. One former bodyguard described finding Elvis unresponsive on the floor of his bedroom on multiple separate occasions, not once, not twice, but repeatedly in the months before August 1977. Not unresponsive in a way that suggested a long-term cardiac condition. Unresponsive in a way that pointed directly at acute pharmaceutical crisis. None of it was reported. Not to a hospital, not to a health authority, not to anyone outside the walls of Graceland. Because reporting it would have meant stopping. And stopping was the one thing the machine around Elvis Presley could not afford. What makes this even more unbearable is what came next. After Elvis died, within weeks, in some accounts within days, members of the Graceland household staff began receiving documents to sign. Confidentiality agreements, structured carefully enough to hold legal weight, quietly distributed before the estate had even been formally organized. Some signed without fully understanding what they were giving up. Some signed because they needed the financial security and had no leverage to refuse. And some, a handful, refused, walked away, and eventually, years later, began to talk. Their accounts, cross-referenced with the partial documentation that has since surfaced, paint a portrait of deliberate, coordinated concealment. Not the panicked cover-up of people acting in shock and grief. Something more organized than that. Something that suggested the people managing the aftermath of Elvis's death had thought carefully, in advance, about what the truth might cost them. But here's what nobody talks about. What those sealed files implicated went beyond Dr. Nick, beyond Colonel Parker, beyond the Memphis Mafia and the NDAs and the Vegas machine. They pointed toward a third name, someone far closer to Elvis than any of them. Someone the public has defended, celebrated, and mourned. Someone who, if the documents are to be believed, knew exactly what was happening inside Graceland. And said nothing. There is a particular kind of silence that descends when powerful people decide that the truth is too inconvenient to survive. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It works through paperwork and legal classification and the quiet reassignment of documents from one category to another, from evidence to privacy, from public record to sealed file, from inconvenient fact to comfortable story. And in the case of Elvis Presley's autopsy, that silence was constructed with extraordinary precision. What the public received in August 1977 was a cause of death. Cardiac arrhythmia. 2 words that explained everything and revealed nothing. What the public did not receive, what was carefully withheld, reclassified, and eventually sealed behind layers of legal protection, was the full picture of what Elvis Presley's body actually showed on the day it was examined. And that picture was not the story of a man whose heart simply gave out. It was the story of a man who had been chemically overwhelmed. The Bioscience Laboratory Toxicology Report, the private analysis commissioned independently from the official one, The document that surfaced partially in 1994 and more completely in the early 2000s through the work of investigative journalists and persistence that bordered on obsession, identified 14 separate drugs in Elvis Presley's system at the time of his death. 14. Among them, codeine was present at 10 times its therapeutic level. Quaalude residue was identified. A combination of barbiturates was documented that medical experts, reviewing the findings decades later, testified would have carried lethal potential entirely on its own, independent of any underlying heart condition, independent of anything else in that body. Each of those substances alone might have been explainable. Together, in those concentrations, they told a story that had nothing to do with a cardiac event and everything to do with what had been prescribed, administered, and consumed inside the walls of Graceland over months and years. Dr. Forrest Tennant, one of the most respected forensic pharmacologists in the country, reviewed the Elvis case independently and went on public record with a conclusion that was as precise as it was damning. He stated that the pharmaceutical findings documented in the toxicology report were, by themselves, sufficient to explain Elvis Presley's death. And he went further. He described the official classification of the cause of death, cardiac arrhythmia, with no qualifying acknowledgement of the pharmaceutical context as, in his exact words, a professional and ethical failure. Not an oversight, not a limitation of 1977 forensic science, a failure. Deliberate in its omission, consequential in its impact, and protected by the same institutional machinery that had shielded the prescribing records and the personal letters and every other piece of documentation that complicated the approved narrative. And it is those personal letters that bring this section to its most painful point. According to sources who had direct access to the sealed file before the full protection was formally applied, people who later spoke carefully, reluctantly, and in some cases anonymously to journalists and researchers who spent years pursuing this story, Elvis had written to at least one close confidant in the period before his death describing something that, once you hear it, you cannot unhear. He wrote that he felt he was being kept sick. Not in those clinical terms, Elvis was not a man who expressed himself that way. But the meaning was unmistakable. He described medications given to calm him down that made him feel worse, not steadier. He described asking more than once to reduce what he was taking, to step back from the pharmaceutical regimen that had become the scaffolding of his daily existence. And he described being told by the people around him, the people he trusted, the people he depended on, the people who framed every conversation around what he needed to keep performing, that he needed those medications, that without them, he couldn't function, that the discomfort he felt was the illness talking, not the treatment. He believed them, because they were the only voices he had. What makes this so significant, beyond the personal tragedy of it, beyond the image of Elvis Presley writing those words in private while the world outside Graceland thought he was simply aging ungracefully, is what it reveals about motive. The question that every investigation into the sealed files eventually circles back to is not just what happened to Elvis, but why the truth about what happened to him was so aggressively protected. And the answer, when you trace it through the financial architecture of his final years, is brutally simple. Dr. George Nichopoulos, known to everyone around Elvis simply as Dr. Nick. He had been Elvis's personal physician for years, part of the inner circle, part of the machine that kept the king functioning well enough to perform, to travel, to exist under the crushing pressure of being Elvis Presley. And in the final 20 months of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick prescribed him more than 10,000 doses of medication. 10,000 doses. In less than 2 years. Amphetamines, barbiturates, opiates, sedatives. A pharmaceutical architecture so elaborate and so relentless that it is genuinely difficult to look at it and see anything other than a system designed to keep a man sedated, functional on demand, and chemically dependent in a way that served the schedule around him rather than the body carrying it. A Tennessee Medical Board investigation was launched after Elvis's death. Dr. Nick faced scrutiny. His prescription records were examined. The volume and variety of what he had been dispensing to a single patient were laid out in plain sight. And at the end of that process, after everything that had been documented, after every number had been reviewed, he was acquitted. He continued practicing medicine for years afterward. And the question that nobody in a position of authority seemed willing to ask out loud was precisely the one that deserved the loudest answer. How does a physician prescribe that quantity of controlled substances to one patient without the system intervening long before that patient ends up dead on a bathroom floor? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, points back to the same force that shaped everything around Elvis Presley's final years. Fame, money, access. The insulation that surrounds people at a certain level of cultural power, where the normal guardrails of professional accountability quietly dissolve, because everyone in proximity has something to gain from keeping the machine running. Doctor, Nick had something to gain. The concert promoters had something to gain. The managers had something to gain. And collectively, that web of mutual interest created an environment where nobody with the authority to say stop ever said it loudly enough to matter. Now here is where the sealed records re-enter the picture. Because what independent researchers and investigative journalists have established over the years is that the sealed portions of Elvis's medical documentation reportedly contain more than just test results. They contain physician communications, internal memos, prescription justifications that were written in the language of medical necessity, but that, read against the backdrop of what we now know, paint a very different picture of what was actually happening. These documents were deemed too sensitive for public release. That phrase, too sensitive, is doing an enormous amount of work in this story. Sensitive to the truth, perhaps. Sensitive to the reputations of people still living. Sensitive to an estate that had every financial incentive to ensure the legacy of Elvis Presley remained untouched by the full weight of what his final years actually looked like. And then there is Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, a man who had buried his wife years before and was now burying his only son. By every account, Vernon was devastated in ways that language cannot fully contain. But what has been documented, quietly, carefully, by people who were present in those weeks after Elvis's death, is that Vernon reportedly pushed for the investigation to be closed quickly, to be resolved, to be finalized and sealed away before the public had time to form its own conclusions. A grieving father wanting to protect his son's memory is an entirely human impulse. Nobody would deny him that. But a grieving father actively influencing the pace and scope of a death investigation is something else entirely. And the question it raises, who else was Vernon protecting and from what, is one that the sealed records may still hold the answer to. Because somewhere inside those restricted files, the full chemical story of Elvis Presley's final hours is still sitting. And the people who control access to it have never once offered a satisfying explanation for why the rest of us aren't allowed to read it. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't get celebrated. It doesn't come with applause or recognition or the comfort of knowing that history will vindicate you quickly. It comes with professional isolation, public dismissal, and the slow erosion of everything you built your career on. And in the years following Elvis Presley's death, a small number of people with medical credentials, investigative experience, and nothing personal to gain chose that kind of courage. They looked at the official record, compared it against the evidence they had examined with their own hands, and said clearly on the record, at personal cost, that the story the public had been given was not the complete truth. They were ignored. And that ignored testimony is some of the most important evidence in this entire story. When the Presley family commissioned their own independent pathological review in the aftermath of Elvis's death, 2 physicians were brought in to examine the findings separately from the official coroner's process. And among them, Codeine was present at a level reportedly 14 times higher than what is considered the upper boundary of therapeutic dosage. 14 times. That is not a number that coexists quietly with a natural heart arrhythmia ruling. That is a number that demands its own conversation entirely. But here is where the story moves from shocking to something darker. This was not the first time the medical establishment had taken a hard look at George Nichopoulos. In 1980, less than 3 years after Elvis's death, he had faced a formal investigation into his prescribing practices, an investigation that shocked the medical community, not because it happened, but because of how it ended. He was cleared. Cleared despite the prescription records. Cleared despite the testimony. Cleared in a decision that left many of the physicians who reviewed the evidence openly questioning how the outcome had been reached. But 2003 was different. By then, the legal landscape had shifted. Additional records had surfaced. And in the deposition testimony that accompanied his license revocation, Dr. Nick admitted, for the first time on the record, in language that carried full legal weight, that his prescribing practices with Elvis Presley had been excessive. Excessive. One word. But in a medical legal context, that word is a confession with consequences, and it cracked the wall in a way that nothing before it had managed to do. Around the same time, something else was happening that the public largely missed. Lisa Marie Presley, Elvis's only child, the person who carried his legacy in the most personal and painful way imaginable, was navigating her own complicated relationship with the truth about her father's death. Publicly, she defended his memory with fierce loyalty. She defended the people around him. She pushed back against narratives she felt were exploitative or sensationalized. But people close to her described privately a far more conflicted internal reality. A woman who had grown up surrounded by the same silence that sealed those files, who understood on a deep, instinctive level that the approved version of her father's story had gaps in it, and who, in her later years, had begun moving toward accessing records that had been kept from her as much as from anyone else. Lisa Marie Presley died in January 2023. She never got the full picture. And that fact alone should make every person watching this feel the weight of what deliberate concealment actually costs. But the wall did not hold forever. In 2022, a partial unsealing of probate-adjacent documents in Shelby County, Tennessee, released a small collection of records that had been held under the estate umbrella for decades. Among them was a pharmaceutical prescribing log, not the complete toxicology file, not the personal letters, but a detailed record of what was prescribed, in what quantities, and on what timeline across the final years of Elvis's life. Medical professionals who reviewed it publicly described what they saw in terms that left no room for ambiguity. The pattern documented in that log was not the pattern of reactive medical care. It was not the pattern of a physician responding to a patient's deteriorating condition. It was systematic. It was escalating. And it pointed, unmistakably, toward a deliberate pharmaceutical dependency. Not accidental, not incidental, but constructed and maintained over time. Which brings us back to the man himself. Elvis Aaron Presley, born in a two-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi, raised in poverty, carried by a voice and a presence that the world had never encountered and has never fully recovered from losing. He gave everything, his energy, his body, his privacy, his health, and ultimately his life, to a world that celebrated him publicly while consuming him privately. He was surrounded, at the end, by people whose loyalty had expiration dates and financial conditions attached to it. He was medicated into compliance by a system that needed him functional enough to perform and dependent enough to control. And when he tried to reach through that system, in letters written by hand, in words that were never meant to be sealed away, nobody with the power to help him listened. The files stayed buried because the truth was too expensive for too many people. Because myths generate revenue and complicated men generate lawsuits. Because the image of Elvis was worth protecting even at the cost of the reality of Elvis. But the truth survived. It survived NDAs and estate lawyers and reclassified documents and 50 years of deliberate silence. It survived because truth, real truth, the kind written in a man's own hand about what was being done to him, has a way of outlasting everyone who tries to bury it. Elvis deserved better than what the people around him gave him. He deserved doctors who healed instead of maintained, managers who protected instead of exploited, friends who spoke instead of signed. And he deserved a world that was willing to hear the full story of how he lived and how he died. Not the comfortable version, but the true one. The least we can do 50 years later is finally say his name alongside the truth. If this story hit you the way it hit me, share it with one person. Just one. Because the truth only travels as far as the people willing to carry it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that bell and stay close. Because the stories they tried to bury don't stop here.